We have been discussing already in the first session about the fishery management. And so now we are going to move over to the fishery management. And then later on in the final panel discussion, we will hopefully link those two in a nice way. So we have three different small sessions here, and we start with the first one with Gabriel Michanek, professor at Uppsala University, Environmental Law, and Henrik Christensen, Swedish Institute of Marine Environment. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the invitation. Our topic on this program is ecosystem-based fisheries management, and we have been working since 2011 in a project called Law, Aquatic Ecosystems and Sustainable Fishery, and this project is funded by farmers. The purpose with this project is basically to analyze how the ecosystem approach is reflected in legislation which is related to fishery and water management. So an important task in the project is therefore to investigate how the Swedish Fishery Act relates to the environmental code in Sweden, and also on the EU level to see how the common fishery policy regulation is coordinated with the Water Framework Directive and the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. We should have also looked at the Spatial Planning Directive, but that was not finalized at the time we did this study, but we will probably come back to that later on in the project. We have a few publications. Two of them are published here on the list, and the third one is on the way to review. The topic we will deal with today is based on the first publication, Adaptive Management of EU Marine Ecosystems, about time to include fishery. So.
Well, this study that we will present here today, that Gabriel just mentioned, is based on a presumption. That is, that fish species are part of aquatic ecosystems, and that fishing activities can affect and is affected by the system. This could be conceptually illustrated by this picture, borrowed from this article. To give some examples, fish species are dependent on other species, but also on water quality. When water is polluted, fish species can be negatively affected. Fishing activities do not affect only exploited commercially species, but also other species, and even water quality through changes in the food web. Some studies indicate that overfishing of large fish predators, such as cod, can change, for example, the balance of nutrition. So another presumption for this study is that these connections must be reflected with and dealt with within the legal system. So a question then arises is if and how these connections are reflected in the law. So in this case, limited to EU law and marine waters. More specifically, or first, maybe I should just answer, although I think it's kind of clear, everyone knows this already, but EU, on the one hand, has adopted legal acts for water management, as already mentioned several times today. These directives include holistic ecosystem approaches with adaptive planning tools. Both the Marine Strategy Directive and the Water Framework Directive, which, as you know, is also applicable to coastal waters, include such approaches. On the other hand, the EU has adopted specific legislation regulating fisheries within the common fishery policy. So therefore, our study took its point of departure into overall research questions. The first one is, how is current knowledge on fish species and fishing activities included in the water management directives and adaptive planning under those directives? Secondly, how does the adaptive planning, according to these directives, influence decision making under the CFP when it comes to restriction on fisheries. So Gabriel will now give you some of the conclusion of the first research question.
Both the Water Framework Directive and the Marine Strategy Framework Directive are based on adaptive planning, as you probably know. This picture relates to the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and the preparation phase is rather complicated, and I will not describe it in detail, but basically it means that waters are first assessed and also the impacts and pressures on the waters. After that, good environmental status is determined, which is the objective, and targets are used to guide progress towards this objective. Also monitoring programs are adopted. And finally, program of measures are decided for the next 6 years, what kind of decisions and measures are necessary to achieve and maintain a good environmental status. Now this, as you know, the system means that you have to implement the program of measures, you monitor the results and you evaluate, and for the next 6 period you might have to revise the system, for example, by adopting other kind of measures in order to more safely achieve and maintain the good environmental status. The adaptive management according to the Water Framework Directive is basically the same. The terminology is quite different, but the system is basically the same, and I won't describe that. So, both the directives are based on a holistic approach. It includes the marine ecosystem, and it also includes different kinds of activities which affect the marine system, the marine waters. So we were curious to see if the current knowledge on fish fauna and on fishing activities were included in this adaptive planning according to the 2 directives. And in order to answer that question, we looked into the details of the directive, the annexes also, of course, and asked, for example, if fish fauna is a biological element in the under the Water Framework Directive. And biological elements are crucial when the ecological status is assessed and also determined for different kind of water bodies. We asked basically the same question as regards the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and also we asked if fishing activities were addressed in the program of measures according to the 2 directives. And the 3 main conclusions we could draw from this investigation was these. Composition, abundance and structure of fish fauna is a biological element for ecological water status, but only for inland waters and not for marine coastal waters, which is an important observation because fish is of course part of the water ecosystem in coastal waters and thus affects the ecological status of that kind of water body as such, but also because coastal waters are hydrologically and ecologically connected with inland waters, not least because some fish species are migrating between these 2 different water types. And secondly, we could see that Water Framework Directive does not require that program of measures include fishing activities in any type of water, not inland waters, not coastal waters. This is also important observation. Of course, a member state could, take into account that it's a minimum directive, still apply the program, still formulate program measures which address fishing activities. We studied the Swedish program of measures and found that no fishing activities are included in a fairly concrete level there. If you look at the Marine Strategy Directive, we found that fish fauna is considered from various aspects. It's far more detailed in that respect than compared to the Water Framework Directive. It's not only composition, abundance and age structure which is included, but also biodiversity aspects, seabed integrity and the food web is, from these perspectives, fish fauna is included. And also fishing activities are included in the MSFD. But the point is that member states have a significant degree of discretion in this directive. States are not explicitly required to include fish fauna and fishing activities. And this is the legal situation for all kinds of marine waters. And it means if you look at coastal waters that the risk is that none of the directives will actually integrate fish and fishery aspects sufficiently. Water Framework Directive because of the lack of rules, and the Marine Strategy Directive because of the member states' discretion. So that was the first research question, and Anna will now speak about the second.
Well, at the time of writing and publishing this article, the new CFP had still not entered into force. However, in the beginning of this year, the new CFP regulation was adopted. And put shortly, the new CFP is from several environmental aspects of progress. For example, when it comes to the member states' possibilities to protect habitats and species listed in the Habitats Directive or the discards, for example. The need to increase the environmental protection into the fishery policy was also made clear during the CFP reform. And for example, the dependency of the fishery sector and the marine ecosystem was clearly stated in the Commission Green Paper in 2009. We could just also say that this view is also in line with the general principle in the Treaty on Environmental Integration into other EU policies. So, how is this formulated in the legal frameworks? Well, firstly, in the CFP regulation itself, there's an objective to manage fisheries from an ecosystem-based approach. However, when you start looking into the actual requirements, you find few strict legal requirements. For example, when it comes to the content of multi-annual plans. Words such as may or where possible are often used. So to put it shortly, the CFP regulation gives possibilities, it doesn't hinder fishery measures to be based on an ecosystem approach. But as it's formulated, such consideration is not assured. Then, when it comes to the need to relate the CFP to the adaptive planning under the water management directives, such recognition can be found in political decisions, but also on policy levels in both the CFP regulation, but also in the directives. For example, in the CFP preamble, I think item 11, it is stated that, where is it? The CFP should contribute to the protection of the marine environment, to the sustainable management of all commercially exploited species, and in particular to the achievement of good environmental status by 2020, as set out in Article 1 in the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. There's only explicit reference to the Marine Strategy Framework Directive and not to the Water Framework Directive. This need to relate the different policies is also expressed in the water directives. However, there are no legal requirements in the CFP regulation to actually take into account specified water objectives, water quality standards, targets, or the programs or measures when taking different fishery decisions. So again, we will say it is possible to make use of the adaptive planning under these directives, but the legal system doesn't assure that this is actually done. So these conclusions should also be seen in relation to the fact that the decisions, for example, on total allowable catches, are never questioned and brought to the European Court of Justice. Member states are probably too much involved to bring a case, and environmental organizations have in practice no possibilities to bring a case to the court. This is at the same time, as documented by the EU Commission, decisions on total allowable catches often deviates from scientific advice. From this, it's obvious that also the adaptive planning under the Water Frameworks Directive will be disregarded, and especially as there is no formal requirements to take them into account.
So, if we shall try to conclude what we have just said, marine adaptive planning, especially according to the Marine Strategy Directive, may include both fish fauna and fishery activities, which means that fish fauna can be considered in a marine ecosystem context, and also that fishing activities can be dealt with in connection with other activities also affecting the ecosystem. So ideally, such holistic plans could be useful for the subsequent decision making according to the CFP regulations, which is also based upon the ecosystem approach. So I think on the one hand, one can see the two directives together with the new CFP regulation as, from a historical point of view, a progress from environmental perspective. But on the other hand, it's also necessary to say that the three legal acts do not ensure a connection between the marine adaptive planning and the decisions taken according to the CFP regulation as regards fishery measures. Because there is no guarantee that fish species and fishery are included in the marine adaptive planning, and there is no requirement in the CFP regulation to actually comply with the planning or even take it into consideration from a legal point of view. And that was what we would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. As we said, we're doing it so that we have a panel discussion at the end of that session. So please, Henrik, I would like to present now Henrik Österblom. He is the docent at the Stockholm Resilience Centre and also associated to the BEAM program.
Can you hear me now? Yeah? Okay, good. Put this in my pocket while turning it off. Okay, good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about some of the research that I've been involved with the last few years. To sort of give you a brief description of my starting point, it's very much reflected in what Carl was saying, that humans shape and are shaped by complex ecological dynamics. So there's sort of a social ecological systems perspective. And this is a figure from a paper. It was actually not a paper, it's in my thesis because the reviewers thought that the pictures were useless. But the point of this figure is it describes the ecological dynamics of the Baltic Sea between 1900 and 2000. And you can see the first two curves illustrate a very dramatic decrease in seals, followed by a very rapid increase in the cod stock, the black line here. And after the collapse of the cod stock, well, at least rapid depletion in the late 80s, you see a very large increase in small pelagic fishing sprats. So just to illustrate that, a lot of things have happened during the last century. There's been substantial dynamics in the ecosystems, and humans and climate and all these different activities have really shaped these dynamics. So when we start to think about how do you manage ecosystems, we thought that we had a pretty good understanding of what the ecosystems are and what the major components of an ecosystems are. And when we wanted to study these things with a social ecological perspective, we needed to think, so what is it in society that we should be thinking of? So we created this little framework that I'm not going to bore you with the details of that, but it's a framework where to try to pinpoint the things that should be studied in order to understand society, in order to understand social ecological interactions in the Baltic Sea. So this, I guess, a roadmap for study. We were trying to look at how actors are operating in the ecosystems and how they are adapting to these different ecological dynamics, how the organizations that are managing these actors are changing over time, how sort of the political context is shaping the capacity of the managing organizations to actually manage these actors. And then we also looked at markets and technologies, norms and knowledge systems. These things in italics are not things I'm going to touch on in this talk, but I'm going to address some of the work we've done in relation to these other sort of major components of the sort of system as we defined it. So some of the key questions that we wanted to look at were, how do managing organizations adapt to changing social and ecological dynamics? How do actors, in this case fishermen, adapt to changes? And what factors are actually driving change in these actors? Are they affected by ecosystems, by policies, by markets, by all of them, or do different, can you illustrate which of these things are more important to drive change? And then we also looked at compliance and tried to figure out why do actors actually follow rules, and again, how the political context influenced the development of laws and regulations. So this little short expose I will just describe some of the studies that we've been engaged in. This is a study led by Matilda Wahlman, who is just now finishing her PhD thesis on HELCOM, where we looked at, so how well is HELCOM actually doing? We've heard that HELCOM is a role model in a European context, but in this study we wanted to compare HELCOM with two organizations that have been described globally as leading in developing ecosystem-based management in an international context. So we used a theoretical ideal case of adaptive management or adaptive capacity, and then we compared this ideal case study with HELCOM, with the Southern Ocean and the work in Kamilar and the Coral Triangle Initiative in Indonesia, the Philippines, and that area there. So we tried to look at are there good examples of adaptive capacity in these organizations, and can HELCOM learn from these activities? And we found that in fact HELCOM is doing a lot of things in a good way, but there's also very much potential for learning and improvement of the way HELCOM is working. So judging from the experiences in the other case studies, we found that HELCOM could really increase stakeholder participation. They could improve their compliance mechanisms. They could work on improving their conflict resolution mechanisms, and they could also work more actively in continuously evaluating their own performance. So if you're interested in these details, you can grab Matilda during the break, or we'll be happy to send you this paper that's just now accepted. But to move on to the fishing management, this is a work by Jonas and Totti Sundberg, another PhD student who's slightly over halfway. The black dots here are fishing vessels fishing for sprat. Remember that species that really shot up in the 90s. And the red places are when they're not steaming but fishing. So a little short illustration of these activities over the period of a few days, hopefully. This is the kind of data that we used for our analysis, where we had information on how many vessels, how much are they fishing, how often are they landed, what should they be landed, and so on. And we looked with all this information to try to understand what have they actually been catching, or what have they likely been catching, depending on their fishing efforts and their activities, and what have they reported that they have landed. And what we found was pretty big differences. We found that these actors had really grabbed the opportunity of these rapidly changing ecosystem dynamics. We found the official catches of herring and sprat here to the right are the solid lines. And then the sort of the dotted lines are model, and the thicker dotted line is the model average for 16 different models that Jonas developed to look at these dynamics. And we thought we in general, there's a very big misreporting in which species they catch, and they report in general a lot less than what they are catching. And we were really concerned with these data and thought that this is a major problem for fisheries management, because this is the kind of information that goes in the stock assessments. So you get, by non-compliance, you get misreporting and wrong information in the assessments. So you get advice that's based on bad data, that's bad. So you get sort of really bad cycles of where non-compliance is really driving systems towards bad management. And we were really nervous in introducing this information to the fishing industry. And we showed this data to one of the, I would guess, leaders in pelagic fisheries in Sweden. He read these papers a few times, and he said, yeah, that's about right. So it's very clear that this, it's two things. I mean, first, it's very clear they adapted to change. And as you can see, it's an increasing match over time, at least if you pool these. So management is catching on, but it takes about 15 years or slightly over 10 years for management to really develop tools and regulations that are in line with what the ecosystem is doing in this case. And the fact that he could admit that they did misreport very substantially was that this was not really regarded as a problem. I mean, they were breaking the laws, but it was not really that. So it was sort of in a legal gray zone. So what we did then was trying to understand a little bit more how much is the ecosystem driving change when looking not only at the sprat fishery, but all the Swedish fisheries. How much is fish pricing driving change, and how much are actually regulations driving change. Again, this is work by Jonas primarily, and he sort of described all the Swedish fishing activities, he defined them as a number of different strategies, and then he looked at the change in the number of fishermen active in that strategy over time. And then he looked at sort of correlations between the dynamics of the number of fishermen with ecological dynamics and prices and regulations over time. So he did a correlation analysis where he looked at all these sort of 16 different fishing strategies to look at what's primarily driving these activities. And his conclusion was that prices and ecological dynamics didn't have a very large effect. I mean, it had a large effect on the sprat fishery. But looking at all these fisheries combination, it was really regulations that had the strongest effect. So regulations actually do have a strong effects. I think that's a question that's open for discussion, but in this case it really has had an effect on the dynamics of these fishermen. And he could also see that regulations were driving a lot of the large-scale fisheries into increased specialization, and it was driving smaller-scale fisheries into diversifying their activities. So in another study where we looked at sort of these different factors that drive change, we together with Bryhn and Boonstra, we tried to review fisheries activities in relation to compliance, and we reviewed sort of political science literature, economics literature, environmental law literature, and ecology literature in fisheries. And the fourth case study that came up in our review, unfortunately none from the Baltic Sea, so we're working on that one now, were two from the Southern Oceans and the Barents Sea with very high level of compliance and well-functioning fisheries management, and two with very low levels of compliance and unsustainable fisheries management. And we used a study called process tracing, where we try to look at developments over time. And we can really see how the political context and the legal regimes and the markets had really changed all these, really influenced all these systems over time. So it was interesting when you looked at the political science literature describing one case study, they had their favorite model of describing what they had seen. And if you look at the economics literature, they had their favorite model of explaining what had happened in the system. But when it was really interesting to look at all these different literatures combined, then you could really see how these different dynamics were sort of shaping change over time. And one thing that was really stood up as interesting in this historical study we did over a period of 200 years was the fact that the Soviet Union seemed to be influencing all these case studies in one way or the other, which we thought was somewhat surprising. So what we did was try to look at more in depth into the Soviet Union. And in a paper that Carl and I worked on, that's coming out this November, we tried to look at the historical expansion of the Soviet Union and its fishing activities. So the Soviets started their fishing in freshwater lakes and rivers, expanded into the Baltic and Black Seas in the 1950s, and sort of in their neighboring areas. In the 60s, they expanded substantially to the American west and east coast, and also down to West and South Africa. In the 70s, they expanded very substantially. These are million tons over a period of 10 years, the different 10-year periods here. In the 70s, they expanded further in West Africa. And in the 80s, they were really forced to pull back a lot of their fishing activities closer to their own borders. And when we looked at the effects of these things on management institutions, we found that Soviet Union seemed to be not only instrumental in driving ecological change in some of these places, but they also were instrumental in driving the development of new legislations and new policies, and actually a new global legal regime for the ocean. So the UNCLOS and the regime with the formalization of the exclusive economic zones was to a large extent actually driven by Soviet distant water fishing activities. So when they were fishing, it doesn't show up on this map because the volumes were so small at a relative global scale. They were fishing in Argentina on the Patagonian shelf in the mid-1960s, and that triggered Argentina to develop their 200 nautical miles. It wasn't an EEZ there, it was called a fishing zone something. So the Soviets moved to Uruguay, and then Uruguay declared their 200 nautical mile zone. So the Soviets moved to Brazil, and Brazil established their own nautical zone, 200 miles. And this is this is 1969 and 70. And a few years later, the US started to establish their own economic zones, as did Canada, and then Norway, and then Europe, and then all countries in the world follow. So I think it's safe to say that these sort of global actors that Carl touched upon have had an instrumental role in the past in shaping global policies and legal regimes. And why I talk about this in the Baltic Sea context is also the fact that when we looked at the combined volumes harvested by Soviet fleets, these are official FAO data for the Baltic Sea, and it's total 1,000 tons of catches. The red line is the Soviet Union, then you have the other states in gray, and then you have Denmark and Poland, two of the other major states here. The Soviet Union was really the major biomass remover from the Baltic Sea, and this is the time period of the regime shifts. And when we looked at several of these large marine ecosystems, we found that in fact the the Soviet Union was one of the major removers of biomass in all marine ecosystems that regime shifts have been documented. This doesn't prove that the Soviet Union was responsible for the regime shifts, but we think that they could have played a very substantial role in this context. So definitely they did influence the global legal regimes, and they likely have contributed to many of the ecological regime shifts we've seen around the world. So in summary, ecosystems are shaped both by natural dynamics and human actors. And these actors that are operating these systems are shaped by both complex interactions in the ecosystems and historical context. Management really matters, and we are now trying to understand how is the ecosystem approach, how has it really developed in Swedish context. So what has happened since 2002 is actually then the Swedish government said formally that they are going to have an ecosystem approach when they work with the marine environment. Now it's 2014, and we're, I guess you can say, finally seeing some progress with marine spatial planning. I think that's the major event that has happened during this time period. What's interesting though is that the concept of marine spatial planning is already now evolving rapidly into something called dynamic oceans management, where primarily the US is leading that. So I think if Sweden wants to be a forerunner and wants to develop an innovative way of doing it, then we really have to move fast, because other countries are really way ahead of us. So with that, I'd like to thank my co-authors, funders, and I also primarily want to thank the organizer. I think it's really nice to have so many people from different disciplines and several representatives from the ministry and the agency and NGOs, so we can have this kind of discussion that I think the problems and its solution really requires. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Henrik. Very interesting talk. We're moving over to Andreas Bryhn. He is a senior researcher at the Swedish Agricultural University in SLU Aqua, and living now and working in Öregrund. Please, Andreas, the floor.
Så. Ja. Och så sätter man den här i fickan. Good morning, everybody. My name is Andreas Bryhn, and I'm going to talk about ecosystem-based managed fisheries management. I use the acronym EBFM and the extent to which it exists. So I'm not going to talk so much about the Baltic Sea, and you will soon understand why, hopefully. So why ecosystem-based fisheries management? Well, for several decades we've been managing fish populations and fish stocks in a way that hasn't been considered sustainable. Very easily we've been able to overexploit the resource, and so over the last 10-15 years or so there's been an increasing consensus that we need a different approach to fisheries management. So that's why this idea with EBFM has come up. Now, there's probably been 100 papers written on the theory about EBFM, several books and reports in addition. And so the general view about what EBFM is can sort of be boiled down to this slide. There's of course much more to it, but this is like a brief summary. It involves the social, environmental, and economic aspects. They should be about equal part in the whole EBFM circle. Should be of these three components. So, what was said before, ecosystem services is an important part of it. And also to take into account not only the commercially interesting fish species, but the whole ecosystem. So it's not only about taking care of the fish resource, but also taking care of the ecosystem. And it's a circular process, as you can see from the circle. So it's basically supposed to start, and when it's finished, it should start all over again. So it should be continuously improved. Another important part of EBFM is that it should be based on stakeholder involvement. So professional fishermen, recreational fishers, environmental organizations, the general public, and whoever can be considered to have a stake in the fisheries should be involved in this process, ideally. Another important part of EBFM is to have reference points for each ecosystem that's being managed. Now, what's a reference point? Well, it's something that can be measured. It has to be both either ecological, economic, or social. So, for instance, an ecological reference point could be total fish biomass, just as an example. And an economic reference point could be the total value of ecosystem services. Now, this is a list of some of the characteristics that are that we should have for reference points. They should be quantifiable. We should be able to measure them. They should be simple, should be able to convey their message to the general public, to other stakeholders. They should be logical, relevant. They should also be reliable. They should convey the information that they're supposed to convey. They should be comparable from one year to another, and preferably also between different ecosystems. So these reference points should be, they should be possible to monitor, and they should also be possible to predict, because we want to be able to say something about how will the ecosystem change if we decide to manage the ecosystem in a different way. And like I said, ecological, social, and economic reference points are needed in the theory of EBFM. So much about the theory. There's not been very much EBFM in practice so far. I only know of 2 examples in the world, and I'll tell you a little bit about them. One is in southern Australia, where they had a lot of commercial fish species, a lot of discards, and the fish stocks weren't very healthy. It was substantial overfishing. So the Australian Board of Fisheries gathered a group of stakeholders, got them together to talk and decide, with the help of scientists and other experts, how should we manage this system in the future in South Australia. So about 30 reference points were set up, a model framework was set up, and a new management model was brought forward as an agreement within the stakeholder group. So now they're starting all over again. This study was recently published, as you can see, from this year. And some of the challenges have been to decrease the fish fleet. And there are still high pressures on some fish stocks. And there's still a problem with discards. Discards is when you throw fish overboard that you don't bring to land. The other example in practice is the Galapagos Islands that belong to Ecuador in the Pacific. It's one of the largest marine reserves in the whole world, and since a decade or so back, they have a consensus-based co-management of stakeholders. And they've decided to prohibit industrial fishing from other countries, so international fleets cannot enter the waters of the Galapagos Islands and fish. It's been divided into zones. The fishing zone is the only place where you can do recreational fishing, and the tourism zone is the only place where you can do diving, boating, snorkeling, etc. One of the achievements is that around the Galapagos Islands, they've achieved increased protection for sea perch, that's threatened, but spiny lobster, as you can see on the picture, and sea cucumber are still overfished. So they are also starting the process all over again to see how they can improve management in the future, so to not have these species overfished in the future. And there's been a deficiency of social and economic research on the Galapagos Islands. But this example has been described as an EBFM in the international literature, also very recently. So this brings us to the question, how does it look in the Baltic and in Sweden? And thus far, we haven't had any examples described in the international literature, but we have some examples that are close. And it's an official ambition in Sweden and the EU, as we were told before, and the CFP. It's not mandatory, but it's still expressed as a sort of an ambition. It's also attainable, as we can see, from the examples in Australia and the Galapagos Islands. It's very popular. I've talked to a lot of people in different occasions about this, and about the only critical comment I've got is that, well, what if the local community doesn't care about the marine environment? My answer to that is that they seem to care a lot about the marine environment. The general public seems to have a great interest in the marine environment. So I don't think that that will be a problem, but that's, of course, something we will have to monitor. Other than that, I only got positive comments, like saying that, yes, this is the way we should work in the future, with stakeholders, reference points, and so on. And there's a plan for next year to set up an example in Sweden to have EBFM in practice. And that's an area called the 8 Fjords. It's on the west coast. And there will be more examples to follow. Unfortunately, none of these areas are in the Baltic Sea that are the closest to attaining an EBFM status that would pass in the national scientific literature. So the area that's been selected, as I told you, is called 8 Fjords. It consists of 8 different fjords on the west coast here in Sweden. It started out as a local initiative, that there were local concerns that our natural resources are disappearing. We should do something about it. So they got together. They got support from authorities to set up a co-management among stakeholders. And I believe this is a critical step to attaining an EBFM status, that you need to get the stakeholders together. That's probably the most difficult task. Once you have the stakeholders, you can get the other pieces of the puzzle together in an easier way. There are many concerns in the 8 fjords, among other things, cod, flatfish, and eelgrass. And they are now currently managed in the local co-management, and they've decided, with support from government agencies and scientists, that they should have no-take zones, which is places where you're not allowed to fish. There's been more mussel farming in the area, and a prolonged tourist season, which is seen as good in the area. It's been very popular. They've done surveys among the local population that people are in general very satisfied with this new management model. In contrast, there are few reference points that have been extracted, and documentation and research is lacking in this 8 fjords area. The second example out of 4 is a lake in southern Sweden, Lake Vättern. And they've also had co-management among stakeholders since 2005. And some of the concerns in Lake Vättern have been Arctic char and whitefish, which have been historically overfished, but as management has proceeded, the threat seems to be less today than it was a few decades ago and a few years ago. So they've also decreased the discards in this co-management. And similar to 8 fjords, documentation is scarce. There are only a few reference points available. And there's a special challenge in lakes and also along the Baltic Sea coast that doesn't apply to some other areas, is that there are people who own water, who have ownerships to waters. And this is an interesting question that I would like for you law people to dig into. How could this be compatible with ecosystem-based fisheries management? How can stakeholders decide anything that infringes with the rights of the owners of these waters? The third example is Lake Vättern, also in southern Sweden. It's the largest lake in the EU and also the largest lake in Sweden, of course. And they've had co-management since a few years back, and some of the concerns presently are toxins in whitefish, and this has led to a sales ban. They can't sell this fish, so they've increased the fishing for pike perch. There's also an increase in crayfish, and there are concerns to what this will mean for the ecosystem. And the co-management group, like I said, is active, but there are only a few reference points, like in the previous examples, and documentation and research are lacking. The water ownership is also a challenge. And the fourth example I would like to bring to your attention is Kosterhavet National Park. It's on the border to Norway on the west coast. They've had co-management since year 2000. And it's a little bit similar to the other examples, but they also have the challenge with an open sea. The fish doesn't stay in the area, but goes back and forth into the seas, so which complicates things when you want to manage it locally. So to wrap it up, the first two examples of EBFM in practice have been documented recently. Ecosystem-based fisheries management is popular and it's attainable. We've seen them in practice, and it should be possible to have this also in Sweden and elsewhere around the Baltic Sea. Our strategy has been to start in a small scale and then as an ambition to expand it, to have it in a larger scale in the future. The first plan is to start with 8 fjords in 2015. There are more examples to come. And our challenge in selecting these areas, one of the challenges which is connected to law, is that the water ownership can create constraints for the co-management in the area. Thank you.
Very much. Can I ask, please, all the speakers to go to the floor now? We open the panel discussion. Okay, thank you very much for the interesting talks. They were very widespread. So we had talks about the adaptiveness and the frameworks by the first two speakers. And then Henrik went over the approaches of global actors and fishery management. And Andreas showed the examples from the ecosystem-based fishery management, the Galapagos and Southern Australia. So thank you very much. First, before we open the floor, do you have some comments to each of you, or are you having some questions about different talks? No? Okay. Good. Thank you very much. Before we further open it to the floor, what's your perspective in how to link the ecosystem knowledge into this fishery management? Do you have some ideas how that could be improved? Maybe Henrik, you want to start on that?
Sure, yeah. I found it really interesting to listen to Andreas' talk, where it's very clear that there's an evolution of these activities, not only in Galapagos and Australia, but also in Sweden. I mean, there's been a number of co-management examples of fisheries in Sweden, and Andreas touched on some of those. And then the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency also initiated a number of co-management examples for integrated coastal zone management. So I think these sort of examples where stakeholders are actively engaged in developing these management activities is very key for learning about how you can integrate the local knowledge and the local approaches. Often these actors have a lot of experiences that is rarely used in practice. I think these are good examples and can serve as inspiration. And some of the cases that I've been involved in previously, there are very many examples where fishermen are actively engaged in contributing to management by measuring temperature and salinity on their boats. That's reported in real time to management authorities, so they can integrate that information in spatial management. There are examples where fishermen have been involved in developing research program to describe the dynamics of fish stocks that they think that scientists have misunderstood completely, and those types of management approaches or the scientific approaches that are in part based on the knowledge of fishermen has, in this instance at least, resulted in substantially larger quotas, because the stocks were a lot larger than the scientists thought, because they weren't sampling them anyway, so they obtain information of the real size of the stock. So I think there are a lot of examples. Some of these are very well documented, and some of them are sort of just floating around out there. So I think it's important that these examples are documented and that it becomes easier for both scientists and managers to understand how and when this kinds of local knowledge can be used in both formulating research programs but also in practical management applications.
All right, thank you.
Can I comment? I totally agree that the stakeholder involvement is a key issue in ecosystem-based fisheries management. The thing you touched on, that they add knowledge to the knowledge base. They sometimes, or in many cases, they sit with information that is not available to scientists and managers otherwise. So you involve them, you get information from them, and you also, when they are involved in a decision, I believe that they are more interested in following the rules that are made altogether in the stakeholder group. So you get a better compliance with rules. I can't say this for certain, but this is something that I think we could foresee.
Are there, just a short question to Gabriel and Anna, are they the participation involved in the frameworks, and in which way?
Sorry,
Are the participation of stakeholders, is that stated in the frameworks, and how is that implemented? In the Marine Fishery Framework Directive, is the participation of stakeholders implemented there? Is it written down?
We haven't really looked into the participation of stakeholders in our study, I'm afraid.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps Ida could say something about that.
Okay.
I don't know, but I know for sure, of course, that the scientists are involved in the CFP work, very much so. And also in the other directives also, but I was thinking about before the decisions are taken on, for example, total about catch quota. So then there is a significant involvement of scientists, which, as Anna said, also which is constantly ignored by the council.
Mm.
But in that sense, there is a participation. I think, yes, thinking about it. There is also involvement of the fishery industry in this process before the decisions are taken by the council.
Mm.
Yes, there is.
And I can just say there's a new research coming up also by scientists from the US, where they want to analyze the participation, because in the US the participation of stakeholders is quite important. But there have been some arguments that the lobby is pushing it into a certain direction, and that might influence also the decision. Okay, anyway, I think I open now the floor to have some questions. Ragnar? Could you please indicate your name and where you're coming from?
Ragnar, Ragnar Bryhn, lead program. Okay, Ragnar Green program in Stockholm University. I was a little bit interested in the terms you use, ecosystem-based fisheries management. Why fisheries? Because it seems that if it is ecosystem-based, it should be ecosystem-based, not just fisheries. So to me, the fisheries is an unnecessary part of that description. If you really want to say you're only dealing with how you handle the fisheries, then it should be ecosystem-based management of fisheries. Otherwise, ecosystem-based fisheries management is a contradiction in terms, because it indicates, on the one hand, that it's ecosystem-based, on the other hand, that it deals only with the fisheries. What is your comment?
I think it's a very good point, and ecosystem-based management and ecosystem-based fisheries management, there are two concepts that are overlapping, or I should say that EBFM is a part of EBM. A lot of these examples are theoretically and in practice described as EBM. For example, the Galapagos Islands is described as an EBM. Yeah, maybe that's the way to go.
Any more questions?
Yeah, just another question. I'm Andreas Bryhn. And I have a question like in the US, we know that the EBM approach and also the EBMF is becoming a legally binding option, so there's no really option for US not to have this approach. So do you think this is limiting in the EU, because it's not such the case, for example, in the EU country? There's no legal binding to have this approach.
You want to answer the question?
Well, I would say I think it's too early to have it legally binding, since it doesn't exist in practice yet. Maybe it's a good idea to have it legally binding, but I think the examples need to develop a little bit further before we make them legally binding. But that's... you can have different opinions on that.
Anybody else from the floor?
What's your question, if it is wishable to have it legally binding, or?
The question was that I think in the US they are moving rather fast with respect to ICES and the EU, because they have an issue that they have to reach a point where this has to be in practice, because it's going to become legally binding if you do not apply an ecosystem-based management approach to fisheries, for example. So if that would be the case also in the EU, that you have a similar cycle like the MSFD, but for the application of the ecosystem-based management approach for fisheries in a 6-year cycle, then you would probably force the member state to be more active and try to really put these things in practice.
Yeah, but I think I'm not sure I heard everything, but I think the legislation have an important function in the settlement to develop more scientific knowledge that we can actually in practice see more examples. So I'm not sure that was the...
Gabriel, do you want to add anything or no?
No, I just want to underline what Anna was saying. I mean, this is, in the US it's very clear that this is creating very strong incentives for spatial protection, for the Marine Mammal Act that's really forcing fishermen to reduce bycatch, and it also creates lots of new opportunities for environmental NGOs to take fishermen and organizations to court that we haven't seen in Europe. So I think if you really want to speed things up, I think this will be the way to go. And I think the US has been very instrumental in leading change. And I was just shortly making reference to the concept of dynamic ocean management. That's sort of the evolution of the US spatial management that they have been pushing. So I think there's, and I don't know if you can attribute all this to the legislation, but I think legislation is really creating an incentive to move fast forward with many of these things that we've been talking a lot about for a long time in Europe without making any real progress.
I guess, can I add something? In the CFP regulation, an objective which is kind of legally binding because the EU shall implement an ecosystem-based approach to fishery management. But then when you look at how this is formulated, words such as endeavor to ensure is used rather than just to ensure. So you can always discuss how legally binding it actually is.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yeah, over there.
I have the question here, the microphone here. Gustav Arnqvist from the Fisheries Secretariat here again. Perhaps I have a question for Gabriel and Anna. Perhaps it's a little bit naive. I don't know if you already answered the question, but you said that if you read the CFP, it's not stated if that it should be compliable to MSFD or the Water Framework Directive. But how is it? Isn't there some general rule on the EU level when it comes to different management regime documents? What document is overruling, and hasn't that been tested for in other disciplines? When it comes to different policies and directives.
I think first it's fair to say that both in policy documents and also if you read the preambles of the legal acts, you can see that there is a wish, an ambition to integrate. We didn't have time to go into that. But if you really look into the rules, the hard rules, the concrete rules, when decisions are taken, you cannot see this obligation to comply with. Or I think the adaptive planning is not even mentioned in the CFP regulation if you look at these rules, as I remember. So there is a clear lack there of connection. On a general basis, there is an integration principle in the treaty, of course, to integrate environmental considerations. But I wouldn't say that this overarching rule would have any significant importance as it is today. I think also it's very important to say, what Anna also stressed in her speaking here, that you cannot bring these conflicts to the European Court of Justice. Because if you could do that, the need for very strict rules would perhaps not be so urgent, because the court could then make the situation, clarify the conflicts and sort of develop the law in that sense. But this is not done. So then that I think is an argument even more for more strict rules, as the situation is today, with the basically politicians deciding.
Okay, thank you. Jonas, you had a question? You can get my one.
Okay. No, thank you. I just wanted to add to your point. I think it's really important how you analyze the legal framework, but I think one should also add the institutional dynamics in the EU on these issues. First, to say that the legal frameworks, they're not written in stone, or they can be reconstrued and understood differently. If one member state take a very ambitious approach in its, marine special planning, that will have an impact not only for other states, but also for how the Commission and perhaps even the court would look at these things, because the court has been, in many cases, I would say, very environmental in its approach. There were times when people were asking whether it consisted of a bunch of ornithologists, the way they interpreted the Birds Directive and so on. And I think it's crucial to point out that you can have an influence by setting high standards at an early stage. The difficulty of reaching there when it comes to fishery, I agree with you, what you point. Maybe the challenge should be to somehow have a national court bringing a case to the Court of Justice, challenge the Swedish policies in the Swedish court. If fishermen or NGOs could do that somehow, maybe that would be one way to bring it up to the supreme judicial instances.
Thanks a lot. My name is Magnus Ekeskog. I work for Oceana, a non-governmental organization. Work with marine and fisheries policy issues at the Baltic Sea office in Copenhagen. Thanks a lot. All the presentations were really nice, and I would like to ask plenty of questions, but I'm going to limit myself to one, to Andreas. I was wondering if you think that any of those case studies that you've been studying and the experiences drawn from those could be applied at a larger scale, for example, at the whole Baltic Sea area. Yesterday, there was a management plan, long-term management plan, proposed by the European Commission for sprat, herring, and cod for the Baltic Sea. And when you look at multi-annual plans and fisheries management plans, usually they have one reference point, maybe two reference points that they are managing the fisheries with, and usually it's only fishing mortality. And if you're lucky, maybe spawning stock biomass. And particularly, I'm wondering if those reference points that you mentioned could be used in a larger scale, for example, in the Baltic Sea multi-species plan. Thank you.
My short answer is yes. I think the Australian example shows that it's possible to have ecosystem-based management or fisheries management in a large sea area. I don't know which is larger, Southern Australia or the Baltic Sea, but I think it shows that the example shows that it's possible to have it on a large scale, so yes.
I think it's important also to know that for the Baltic Sea you have these huge environmental gradients, so it might be a bit problematic having the same indicator or the same target level for the entire Baltic Sea, because you might not have cod in the north. Any more?
Here, we have one here.
Sorry, yeah.
Hello, my name is Britta Eklund. I'm at Stockholm University ITM, and I'm wondering, especially I think my question is to you, Andreas, are you considering the biocides used and antifouling paints in the fishing fleet in your management plans? Because I think it's important, like your proposed working in 8 fjords on the west coast in Vättern and Vättern and so on.
That's absolutely an issue to bring up. It's as we bring the decision making down to the stakeholders, it's basically up to them to decide the extent to which this question is important. But I'm sure that that's toxins and anti-fouling is a wide-known environmental problem. So I'm sure that's going to be a part of it, a part of the EBFM.
More, yeah?
Hi, my name is Gabriel. I'm from Stockholm Resilience Centre. And so over the recent years, we could definitely see some sort of a push for political change towards ecosystem-based management. And therefore my question is, could we already identify strong advocacy coalitions that include politicians, NGOs, businesses, and maybe other stakeholders that are shaping up on the EU level that push for policy change towards ecosystem-based management? So can we see that there is some sort of established network of cooperation, or is it more kind of situation-based and chaotic?
Who would like to answer it?
Well, one part of that answer, I guess, would be the recent Common Fisheries Policy Reform, where the environmental NGO community really pulled together resources to mobilize around the fishing issues, and where several members of parliament really formed interesting coalitions between surprising groups of politicians, and that were able to arrive at a decision that I think was surprising to quite a lot of people. So I think there are emerging and surprising coalitions, at least in the European level, where fishing issues has been sort of very much of increasing attention to several countries. So I don't have a full answer to your question, but I was really surprised by the mobilization of new coalitions during the Common Fisheries Policy Reform.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Ellen Bruno, I work from the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation. I wanted to add on to your questions on this regional management. Of course, we already have Baltfish, which is the regional body for fisheries management in the Baltic. And we have a similar one in the North Sea with the Scheveningen Group. And I was working at the Commission when
well, when these were initiated. And one of the ideas was to get them to be in the same framework as the HELCOM and OSPAR, of course. And that would, of course, would manage this chaotic situation a little bit better, because then it would naturally become an ecosystem approach. As HELCOM and OSPAR already have this, or the other issues. And then you guys said that HELCOM has failed in many ways. But do you think they could master this? Could they have taken on fisheries, and could that have been a better ecosystem-based organization for management the whole Baltic in a better way than we're doing it now? Because the Baltic is apparently only managing fisheries. Did you understand that question? Could that have been a good? Is that something that Sweden could be doing better, maybe?
I think this is a really important question and links nicely back to what Ragnar was saying on ecosystem-based fisheries management. I think you really have to acknowledge that sort of ecosystem approaches in the conventional biological diversity, when it was really sort of first became a mainstream issue, is something that evolved from a really sort of conservation-based environmental sector type community. And now from the fisheries management and fisheries science community, ecosystem-based fisheries management is also evolving and has a lot evolved sideline. So these are very different approaches, and the conservation community has been sort of coming from sort of a history of protecting species and protecting habitats, whereas the fishing community has a completely different angle to these issues. So I think this is really the key challenge of policy integration, where you have similar concepts popping up in completely different sectors, and they have to collaborate. And HELCOM has sort of done what they could have done with their mandate, but of course, as soon as they step into what fisheries agencies are perceived as fisheries management mandates, then they get a little red flag in their face. And I think the same thing happens when sort of the fisheries community is trying to move into the environmental sector. So we've traditionally organized these types of sectors in a way that they don't really talk to each other. And we're becoming increasingly aware that they really have to talk to each other. And I think Baltfish is a really nice example of the fishing sector starting to talk about these issues a lot more. But if you Google Baltfish, or if you try to find any of their documents from any of their meetings, you're not going to have any luck whatsoever. So there's a lot of need for increased collaboration and transparency in these organizations. And I think you can ideally describe a theoretically perfect organization that would work for the Baltic Sea, but I don't know what that would look like. But it's really, it's the progress in the integration between these sectors is just surprisingly slow, given the sort of the how much these issues have been addressed in policy documents. So sorry for not answering your questions. I don't have a good idea for what that organization would look like. But I also think that if you can't really do it in the Baltic, where would you be able to do it? So I think we really have a responsibility for Europe to come up with clever ways of integrating both of these sectors, and coming away from sort of fisheries management with an ecosystem approach, or environmental management with a bit of fisheries in it. So I think that's just, we should have come a lot further than that, I think.
And I just want to add shortly is I think what we are now also in a quite interesting era, because this year was not possible to make a cod assessment because of the first it was the cod recovery plan. It was a small increase in the cod stock. But now and then every year assessment group is meeting and trying to determine what are the next quotas, the ISIS group. And this year was not possible to make such an assessment, because of the pure cod stock condition. And so this is also a very nice way, because in that will push also a bit more research and hopefully bring in these cod stock assessment to a bit more ecosystem assessment related. Okay, I think we thank you very much for your questions. I know there are some more questions, but I think we can stop here, and we can have those questions then later on, either for the final panel or during the lunch break. So I would first, don't let you down here, I would like to give you also a present. So So thank you very much.
Okay.